This video will help you as you read the case of Burger King. For this video, what I want you to focus on is listening to the facts so that you understand them and are prepared to discuss and apply them in class. We'll also make sure that you have the basic rule statements that Burger King gives about International Shoe, and give you some suggestions on how Burger King fits into the overall PJ framework we've discussed. For class, what you should focus on is how the court applies the International Shoe Test to a contract-based contact analysis. In other words, when the cause of action is contract-related, or when the contacts in the state are contract-related, how will the court determine whether or not the exercise of personal jurisdiction over the defendant will be constitutional? In Burger King, you see Burger King itself suing Rujevich, we call him Rudy, makes it easier, and Max Shera. These two individuals were the basically brains and brawn behind a franchise arrangement with Burger King. After sales had taken a downturn, they end up breaching the franchise agreement that they had signed with Burger King. And so Burger King brings a claim against them in Florida court, in a federal district court, for breach of the franchise agreement, which is basically a breach of contract action, and also for use of the trademark without compliance of the franchise agreement. So, in other words, a trademark infringement claim. Rujevich and Max Shera counterclaim against Burger King, claiming that the Michigan franchise laws protected them and that Burger King's practices were in breach of those laws. The only one appealing personal jurisdiction at this time is Rudy, and so that's what we're going to focus on in this particular decision. So, did the court have personal jurisdiction over Rudy in the claims asserted by Burger King against Rudy? So for our purposes, what we're focusing on, the claim that remains, is the breach of franchise agreement. So what is the test? One thing to note about this decision and the test it provides about International Shoe is that Justice Brennan is our author. Why is that important? Well, if you think about it, Brennan was the dissenter in Worldwide Volkswagen. And so the question here is Brennan getting this his way now? In Section 2A, the court sets out the test, and so when you're taking notes about this case, it's a really good section to just pull good rule language for you. So you can focus on those pages and take out the rule statements regarding International Shoe. One thing I'll tell you about the structure of this particular opinion is this section gives you some help when you're outlining, but it's overall not a very good way to write analysis. If you think about it, there's sort of like a giant rules section and then an application section. And you might have noticed when you read it yourself that it's a little bit confusing to figure out what specifically the court is applying, which rule it's applying, what policy is it applying, and that's in part because of the structure of the opinion itself. Having one section on rules and one section on analysis is not a good way to go. You want to integrate discussion of analysis with discussion of the rule on your exam, just like you do through IRAC. So whenever you hit a new rule, you should apply that rule before moving on to a statement about more rules. However, when you're trying to outline for a course, a court that sets out a lot of rules in one section makes your outlining of the rule statements easier. And so this is a good opinion to come back to later when you're trying to find just good rule statements. The rule that the court uses is the same one we've seen: minimum contacts and fair play substantial justice. However, the integration or interaction between minimum contacts and fair play substantial justice is different because Brennan is taking control. One thing when we look at the statements about the rules is Burger King gives us some actual developed language to tell us when minimum contacts is met and when it's not met. So for example, in that Section 2A of the opinion, you'll see the court saying that minimum contacts is met when the defendant himself creates a substantial connection with the state. And when you see deliberate engagement in significant activities, you can find minimum contacts. Also, when the defendant creates continuing obligations between himself and the state. Note that all of these are really good rule statements. Students sometimes confuse these statements with analysis. They believe that because the rule statement is a little bit more clear or spelled out, that somehow this would be a good application in an exam, for example, or in a brief to a court. This is a good starting point, but it isn't actually application or analysis to the facts you're given. What you are seeing here, though, is good rule statements about when minimum contacts might be met. The court also tells us when minimum contacts are not met. For example, it mentions when some unilateral activity on the part of another party creates the interaction with the state, that is not good enough to create minimum contacts. And that shouldn't seem too surprising to us. After Worldwide Volkswagen, that's basically the test the court gives us. The other statement Burger King tells us is that a defendant who has random, fortuitous, or attenuated contacts does not have minimum contacts with the state. So if you're looking for things that are isolated, random means there's not really a connection. Fortuitous, it's just, happenstance. Attenuated, again, non-purposeful or non-really connected. Those kinds of contacts will not be sufficient for minimum contacts. The court also, in expressing its discussion of minimum contacts, talks about the policy rationale behind minimum contacts. You can freeze this frame if you'd like, or pause for a moment and take some of these down, but they're right in the opinion. The first is that purposeful availment demonstrates that the defendant gets benefits and protection from the forum state's laws. So therefore, it's not unreasonable to require him to submit to the burdens of litigation in that same state. If you think about it, this is the quid pro quo rationale. You take something from the state, you need to give back in the form of answering for any kinds of claims that arise out of the benefits you've taken in that form. The other rationale is one we see in Worldwide Volkswagen, that a defendant can reasonably anticipate being hailed into a court of the state. If so, then there's purposeful availment. So these policy rationales are not like the rule statements we just saw, but they are sort of like the reasoning behind why, for example, the minimum contacts factors you see here are sufficient to give rise to minimum contacts. The court also discusses fair play substantial justice and cites to the same factors we saw in Worldwide Volkswagen. If you look to them here, you'll see the factors listed. So the court is still adopting that part of the test. Make sure that you can actually find these 5 factors and see the connection between this description and that in Worldwide Volkswagen. One other point before we end this video is to give you some context of the framework of PJ and how Burger King fits into our framework. So what does Burger King add? Well, this is a case that fits within the specific personal jurisdiction. It also is on the second prong, that of constitutionality, and basically is giving us a little bit more meat to the test. One thing it specifically adds is under minimum contacts, and it gives us application for when we find contacts in the state that are contract-based, or where we can make an analogy to a contract-based contact. What might that be? Well, like a breach of a fiduciary duty would be an example of something that is more akin to a contract, an agreement-based contact. The other thing that Burger King provides for us is really a discussion of the overall balance between minimum contacts and fair play substantial justice. Because Brennan is writing this opinion, it's unlike what we saw in Worldwide Volkswagen. Here, since Brennan really has a lot of focus on reasonability, or the fair play substantial justice piece of the International Shoe Test, this court opinion really tries to explain to us that there's more of a sliding scale in International Shoe. I should pause for just a moment to let you know that this is not going to be the last statement about how the test works, and while Brennan is winning the day now, he will not carry this going forward. But for now, understand that in Burger King, the court is really suggesting that if there's a very strong showing under the reasonableness test, for example, that it is very reasonable to exercise jurisdiction over the defendant, then there can be fewer contacts, or those contacts can have less quality under our analysis of minimum contacts. So in other words, it's a sliding scale. The more reasonable it is, the less important your contacts have to be. If it's unreasonable, however, or seemingly closer to unreasonable, then the stronger your contacts have to be. The burden is on the defendant to show that the contacts are unreasonable. All right, so where does this take you? Well, because this opinion is giving us an explanation of how minimum contacts are addressed in a contract-based contact. In other words, our claim is about breach of contract. The contacts in the forum, Florida, are all contract-based. What I want you to focus on and be ready to discuss in class is the test or the factors the court looks at when there's contract-based contacts and how these are applied. So we're going to spend a lot of time, most of our time in class, really addressing that application. I hope this was helpful, and I'll see you in class.